I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center, and welcome to The Limits of Explanation. I'm now pleased to introduce Harry Eyres, who is sitting with his head, the back of his head to me.
Francis, as you corrected Louis' Gluck, you could correct me to Eyres.
Eyres.
Yes.
Eyres.
Sorry.
And you have none.
Yes. That wasn't meant to be.
Harry Eyres is a journalist, poet, environmentalist, wine writer, and theater teacher. He is former poetry editor, poetry critic for the London Times, and poetry editor for Daily Express, regular columnist in the Financial Times weekend section, and author of Beginner's Guide to Plato's Republic, Bluffer's Guide to Wine, and author of the poetry collection Hotel Eliseo. Mr. Eyres will moderate this. Eyres. There must be some reason for this. Mr. Eyres will moderate this evening's panel and introduce the other panelists. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Francis. Shall I introduce the panel first? Is that
yeah.
And this is I'm afraid I've only just met this very interesting panel, but they're really interesting and diverse group of people. And on my right is Edward Casey, who is distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of New York at Stony Brook, Edward's area particularly is phenomenology, which is a word I was hoping I wouldn't have to say in public ever, because anyway. And he's also been writing a lot recently about place, and he's written 2 books recently, Getting Back into Place and The Fate of Place, the Philosophical History, which sound extremely interesting to me, and I'm going to buy on Amazon as soon as I get home. And he's also written Remembering, a phenomenological study. I told you I wouldn't be able to say the word. Francisca Cho is Associate Professor of Theology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and works in the area of East Asian Buddhism and culture. And I was particularly interested to see that Francisca has translated some poems by the Korean Buddhist poet Man Hye, and many of these, if not all of them as far as I know, are love poems, and they're love poems written by a Buddhist monk, presumably celibate. And I've read a few in her translation, and they're fascinating, beautiful poems. And I think what Francisco is very interested in, and I think the tradition we're talking about here is a tradition that perhaps is quite unfamiliar to most of us, the Korean Buddhist tradition, but Francisco was saying that it has quite a lot in common with the more familiar Zen tradition. And I think Man Hye is a poet who uses paradox, perhaps in the same kind of way that Zen Buddhists use paradox in the form of koan. Bob Michels is Walsh McDermott University Professor of Medicine and Psychiatry at Weil, I don't know how you pronounce that, Medical College at Cornell, and I read has also been Dean of Cornell's Medical School, and is also training and supervising analyst at Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research. I noticed that one of his best-known works concerns the psychiatric interview, when I come on to talk about why I had this idea for the limits of explanation, I'll try to explain why I thought this might have some relevance to psychoanalysis. Mark Norell, I read on the internet, has been described as the Alice Cooper of fossils. I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but Mark is a very distinguished paleontologist, chairman and curator of the Division of Paleontology at the Museum of Natural History in New York, and is a great expert on dinosaurs and dinosaur fossils. And I was also reading an interview with him, which was conducted in Australia, and the main theme seemed to be that there weren't very many dinosaur fossils in Australia, but that's a really irrelevant kind of comment. But Mark was also saying that his real passion is art history, so he's obviously a man who encompasses a lot of diversity in himself, which I hope some of the rest of us do. And then finally I come to Christopher Peacocke, who's Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University, and will, I'm sure, instill a certain amount of philosophical rigour into the proceedings. And has had a very distinguished academic career, having been Waynflete Professor of Metaphysical Philosophy at Oxford University, but came over to the States about 6 years ago, he was telling me. And, well, I think perhaps I should just say a little bit about why, as it's my baby, as Ed said, and I have to admit some responsibility for this idea, which came to me a while ago, and at certain points since, I thought, why on earth did I have that idea rather than a slightly more straightforward idea? But I think what I was thinking about was that we live in a culture that's rather obsessed with explanation. I'm not going to try to define explanation in any simple way, because I just feel it's a word we use a lot and in different ways. But I suppose this has a lot to do with the power and prestige of natural science. But I have the feeling that in the culture generally there's a sense that there are kind of explanations waiting out there for everything, and soon we'll have explained, not quite yet, we haven't quite got there yet, but quite soon we'll have explained all these mysteries. We've managed to explain a lot of things, and soon we'll have explained everything, including the nature of consciousness and origins of the universe and things like that, which have been occupying people for a long time. And to give a sort of more concrete example of this, I was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art this afternoon in an amazing small collection at the very back. I can't even remember what it's called now. The Robert Lehman, was it, collection?
Yeah.
And which is full of masterpieces, and it's a place you might never even see in that huge museum. And I came to a room with a large El Greco, and there was a guy on the sofa in front of it with his wife, and he was saying in German, which I don't speak very well, but I knew what he was saying. He was saying, because I've heard people say this whenever I've been to any kind of El Greco exhibition, he was saying, and El Greco had this eye condition, which meant that that he painted everything in this elongated way, with this air of having explained something, it seemed to me. And that seems to be the case, that people often think with El Greco that that's the explanation, that's why the figures are like that. And it made me think, but yes, maybe, but so what? And does that mean that all his paintings are simply evidence of the fact that he had an eye condition? And is that more interesting than the paintings? Which seemed to be the case for this guy, who seemed to be very proud of the fact that he had an explanation for this. The fact that El Greco painted elongated figures. But I was thinking, yeah, but as I say, so what? It's rather like somebody coming up with an explanation for music. Somebody might, which I think people probably are working in this field. That they no doubt feel that any minute now they'll come up with an explanation for music. But would that be more interesting than music? And I suspect not. In fact, I suspect it would be a lot less interesting than music. That music itself is much more interesting than any explanation of music. And so, what I'm getting at is that we may have been slightly carried away by the success of natural science in explaining a lot of things, into thinking that explanation is a sort of higher order thing than experience or other things, or even enjoyment. So that was my sort of initial idea for this, and I thought that maybe it might be good to start with a phenomenologist, because phenomenology, as far as I know, which is not very far, is a movement in philosophy which sort of puts explanation in brackets in many ways, and by doing that it maybe unlocks a lot of things, or it allows a lot of richness to emerge which explanation might not allow. And so I wonder what Edward might like to say on that.
Well, it's interesting that phenomenology in its post-Hegelian form, the kind of phenomenology that became influential and still is in Europe and parts of America, was, after all, born at the end of the 19th century at a time that's significantly parallel and similar to our time a century later, insofar as it was a reaction to remarkable successes in psychophysics and physicalistic physiology, neurology, And it was a very exciting time scientifically, as we know. And both Freud and Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, were in their own ways dealing with that success. They were both moving away from it in their distinctively different ways. And each of them, curiously enough, as I'm sure many of you know, were students of Franz Brentano at the University of Vienna in the 1870s and early 1880s. And it was really Brentano, whose name is not as well known as Husserl or Heidegger or any of the successors and more recent figures in phenomenology, who in fact set the stage for a serious critique of explanatory natural science in his book Psychology from an Empirical Point of View of 1874. And both Freud and Husserl read that book and took it seriously. You could even argue that Brentano's single most important discovery, which is intentionality, which he defined cryptically as directedness toward a mental content in that book, became differently interpreted the rallying cry for Husserl and Freud, respectively. For Freud, of course, more in terms of meaningfulness of phenomena whose ultimate causation lies in unconscious forces, drives, and so forth. Husserl taking it wholly into, and significantly differently, wholly into the realm of what he called pure consciousness, no interest in the unconscious on Husserl's part. But it was as if the two former students of Brentano each took a certain way of interpreting that discovery of Brentano. And they're strangely complementary, and it would be interesting if it were a long evening to pursue that difference. It's clear that Husserl felt that there was a lot of good work lying ahead just in understanding what it is to be a conscious being at all. And for that reason, he devised a method which he called descriptive, a descriptive method. And he may have been the first, I don't know this is a fact, but I think he was among the first in the 19th century who actually identified a philosophical movement with a descriptive enterprise. By description, Husserl meant what you do after, as Harry's already mentioned, and used exactly the right term for it. You bracket, or you suspend, or you switch off, these are terms that he used, current natural scientific paradigms and methods, not to deny them, not to lose interest in them, to keep them, in fact, of great interest, but not to allow their scientific validity to overwhelm other investigations, which Husserl considered descriptive in character, and investigations which were not looking for ultimate causal explanatory factors in some other region of the mind or some other region of society than that which human beings experience directly in first person or together with others in a shared first person context. So it was a curious enterprise. It was both a critique, or more precisely, it was a limitation of the accomplishments of natural science, setting it aside for the moment. These are all phrases that you find in Husserl's early work, so as to concentrate upon what Husserl called pure consciousness. Well, pure consciousness turned out to be, a very complex region itself, and in subsequent generations you can say that the history of phenomenology consisted in finding different regions of consciousness, some of them not by any means completely transparent or lucid. Some of them were, as Merleau-Ponty would call it, pre-reflective, marginal, latent, or implicit, tacit dimensions of consciousness itself. But each of the primary figures, from Husserl through Heidegger through Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, these are really the four main figures, each would agree that the task is to extend description only as far as consciousness itself can reach, and no further. Once you get further, once you attempt to find a factor that could be said to underlie with some explanatory power that region of mind or consciousness, and the two words were exactly equivalent for these figures, unlike Freud, who as you know better than I, insisted that they're not equivalent. As he says quite explicitly in Ego and the Id, we cannot equate consciousness and mind. Freud, of course, had Descartes in mind when he made that remark. But in fact, phenomenologists were not Cartesian either. They wanted to embark upon a new descriptive enterprise with a new sense of consciousness, far less metaphysical, far less epistemological, far more experiential in character. And for that, the method was said to be descriptive. Therein lies, of course, much more to discuss. What does that mean? How is it pursued? Clearly, each of these great figures did it with a distinctive style and did it differently. But nevertheless, each was faithful to the notion that somehow it was really the realm or the field, as it's often called, the field of consciousness. That's the title of a book written in the central years of the movement by Aaron Gurwitch here in New York City, The Field of Consciousness. And Gurwitch, a student of Husserl at the New School, ended up teaching at the New School, really did a brilliant job of bringing together all the zones, you might say, or subfields of consciousness, and the way that descriptive method has to alter as it explores those different subfields or regions of conscious mind. So it's not as if there's one method, it's not as if there's just description, but description, whatever it is for all of these related figures non-explanatory. That's the one ribbon that goes throughout. Where explanation really means, and Charles Brenner asked us to say something about explanation, each of us, well, at least for this movement, it meant causal explanation, and it meant finding a set of necessary and sufficient causes that could illuminate the etiology or genealogy of a given phenomenon in...
Did you say eliminate?
No, illuminate. Illuminate. Illuminate the etiology or genealogy of a phenomenon, but from a position outside what I'm calling the field of consciousness. The history, the physiology, the deep paleontology, let's say, of the subject. And so the thought was not that those explanatory models, which were inherited both from early modern science and antiquity under various guises, not that they were invalid, they're perfectly important, in fact necessary. And Husserl, who was a mathematician and a great student of natural science, insisted on this throughout his career. So this is not a rejection of explanatory models or of natural science, but it is an effort to supplement it with a distinctively different enterprise that, for some reason, at the turn of that century, seems still to resonate at the turn of this new century. In a kind of
so thanks very much for that. I think Francisca wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I thought it might be interesting to give an illustration of how phenomenology has been applied in the area of religious studies, which is my area, and it's based on Husserl's system, but it's distinct. The phenomenology of religion, which is the school from which in which I was trained at the University of Chicago, very much has as its agenda a description of the religious tradition, the religious experiences of non-Western, non-Christian, non-Judaic religions. And this is often described as an appreciation of what might be called the religious culture, the religious experiences of Buddhists, for example. But it's interesting that in the past couple decades, and I'm sure this controversy has arisen before, there's been an attack on the phenomenological tradition as itself being religious. And I think this gets back to the whole theme of this conversation, that we're mad for explanation. There are scholars of religion who attack the phenomenological tradition as being too sympathetic to religion, as really having the ulterior motivation of proving the reality of God, nirvana, Brahman, what have you. And what we really need in order to have a true explanation of religion is a scientific reductive explanation that looks at, for example, the political, ideological, rhetorical moves within religious doctrine and religious institutions, or even you can throw in neurophysiological explanations of religious experience, but that this is what constitutes a truly scientific academic study of religion. It has to re-describe the native informant's own description. You know, if a Hindu says, this is what it feels like for me to experience Brahman, you can't take that native description. That's verboten in a true explanation. You have to re-describe that in terms of caste structure and how that, you know, creates this priest caste that's more interested in perpetuating its own authority and power through its religious dogma, that this constitutes a true explanation. And this conflict within the study of religion, I think, is very much driven by the modern Western conflict between religion and science, and the whole idea behind that being we're going to find out, we're going to determine what true knowledge is. That's what explanation is about, determining what true knowledge is. And relative to religion, the experiencer does not have that true knowledge. It's only the scientist who has the true knowledge, and it's necessarily reductive.
So here,
Go ahead.
Just a brief comment. So here you see we do have, it seems to be, an archetypal conflict between Husserl's emphasis on trusting your experience within its own limits. Actually, Husserl has an interesting statement. I brought it, but it's in a bag that's in another room, and I won't bring it out. I know it by heart anyway. It's called the principle of principles in phenomenology, which is trust your intuition into an area of investigation so long as you respect the limits of that area. So it's not as if Husserl would say you could just walk into, you know, another culture and take verbatim exactly what people said and regarded this ultimate word. It would be within the limits of that cultural setting that Husserl would want to respect it. However, he would not want to take the next step, which would be moving to a natural scientific explanation of, let's say, verbal utterances made within that caste or that particular setting. So I think here there would be an effort to reassert the validity of description of personal and interpersonal experience, so long as you recognize that there is a very important set of cultural and other, you know, social and political institutional limits within which those utterances, of course, must be situated. So it's a little less naive. I only interpolate this because I think it's a little less naive than it sounds at first. When you hear about Husserl's idea, well, just, you know, trust your intuition and just go with that, it isn't that naive. On the other hand, it still refuses to take that next step into what we could call explanatory science. Now, I don't know if that helps or only complicates the debate.
I had a thought from what you were saying, Francisca, about knowledge itself and in relation to the traditions that you particularly study and the limits of knowledge, which perhaps is not limited to Buddhist traditions, but there's also in Christian mystic traditions. Obviously, there's a famous work called The Cloud of Unknowing, and there's a whole tradition which sort of, in a way, puts knowledge itself in brackets, not just explanation. I was wondering if that's true perhaps in Manhei or other Buddhists, that knowledge itself isn't necessarily isn't the goal of all goals.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to cut off other people's opportunities to speak, but
don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, I think this desire for explanation, at least in my field, has a lot to do with the suspicion of religion, and we mean primarily Christianity in this context. And what's interesting for me as a scholar of Buddhism is when you look at Buddhist philosophy and doctrine, it has its entirely alternative take on the notion of explanation, which kind of pulls the rug out from under the whole debate that's going on in the contemporary West about the nature of knowledge. And the Buddhist understanding is that all explanations, all categorizations, classifications, conceptual categories are artistic conventions, and that you couldn't possibly have anything besides that. All right, so you make that concession from the beginning. You give up that pursuit of knowledge in any ultimate sense. And, it's a form of skepticism that says basically we only work with our linguistic, cultural structures. And once you make that admission up front, the whole debate about what constitutes a valid explanation goes away. Instead, the litmus test becomes what constitutes an effective explanation.
But how do you categorize effective? I mean, to me, like as an empirical scientist, I would say that, like, I mean, there's this thing that's been out there for a long time, this whole, epistemology and ontology kind of thing, the real and the really real. But I think that we try to extend it now to the real, the really real, and the really, really real. And the really, really real is something that we're never going to get at. Okay? That the real is kind of the way that everybody goes about their day-to-day life and interprets the world. The really real is what, as a scientist, that I'm trying to get at. And that it only works when there's rules to the game.
Yes.
And within empirical science, we have those rules because we can say, like, look, that we can have the hypothetical deductive method. We have mathematical rules that we can play with and stuff. And even when people try to go outside of that a little bit, it kind of gets messed up. I mean, probably one of the biggest influences of my own life, thinking of as a scientist, was this guy Paul Feyerabend, who was a philosopher of science who I knew pretty well. And he wrote this great book called Against Method, which he just said that method basically impedes people in scientific progress and everything. But finally, by the end of his life, he'd come around and said, well, we've got to have a few methods, otherwise that people can just say all kinds of wacky stuff, everything, so that we have to, keep it channeled. And it's like this game that you play within a construct of rules to be able to explain the world. And certainly that there's a lot of stuff we should just give up on because we don't have the technology or the mathematical firepower to be able to do it. But at the same time, it's within that construct of rules. And when you go outside of those rules, things become unexplainable. And they're not.
Yeah.
I'm in a state of serious confusion. All my assumptions are turning out to be wrong. I would have thought I was...
That's what they call assumptions.
I would have thought that I was biased scientifically, and I learned that I'm really a Buddhist underneath, which I didn't know.
A lot of scientists discover that, actually. Yeah.
And I didn't think of there being a conflict between experience and explanation, but I hear a suggestion that somehow there's a tension between them, where my view or thought always was that good explanation enhances experience, enriches it rather than competes with it. And the notion of a true explanation or a final explanation, to me, is a religious concept, not a scientific. Explanations are always the best we can do at 10 after 8, to be modified with more data or a better explanation at 10 after 9, where final explanations imply a kind of belief that's, to me, not science. I want to go back, though, to this, to the El Greco. It seems to me if I were there looking at the El Greco and I had a powerful experience, and someone came up to me and said, he had astigmatism. That's why it looks that way. I think I would find that interesting if I didn't know it, and I think I would look for an extra minute knowing that, and probably see things that I might have missed the first time around, and I'd leave feeling, A, that was an incredible painting, and B, that was interesting. And I'll remember that about it, and I'll think about it the next time I see an El Greco. And I'm glad I know it, though it would have never occurred to me that it would replace the experience of seeing the El Greco. And I think that's all generalizable, that explanations would be, you want a definition, that's a crude one, but interesting statements that aren't obvious from pure experience and that have the potential to enrich the experience.
But is that an experiential thing, or there's a difference between something you experience and something you can explain using, as a scientist yourself, to be able to explain with a very cleverly crafted hypothesis and certain either mathematical or analytical tools to be able to test it.
But usually what you mean by an explanation is that it gives you a perspective on the experience or suggests an approach to it that you didn't have before that opens up new experiences. I would say you have a question, and let's say you do a piece of superb science and you answer the question. If that's really a good answer, it generates two new questions.
Sure, but I would say you never answer. You just reject the alternatives.
Right, and that, but also more than reject it. I don't think that's enough. You certainly test the alternatives, and you may reject alternatives. But if it's a really good answer, it also opens up a new way of asking a new question that you never would have thought of before.
Well, I think. But I think I completely agree with your observation, which is certainly right, that the good explanations can be plowed back into experiences and enrich them. But that still doesn't mean that there isn't an initial and deep difference between the aims of description and explanation.
But not in conflict or incompatible.
Well, I think I like your own word, tension. It's really better. No, they're not incompatible, but they're in tension. And I think their tension needs to be respected. It's not as if they're simply the same enterprise, even though done slightly differently. It's more deep going than that. And it seems to me that it makes a real difference in any given investigation, whether you're really looking for the explanation that's appropriate to that phenomenon.
I'm going to go back to our case, to our German...
Could I just bring Christopher in here? Because I just wonder whether he... Christopher.
Yeah, I do have views on this. Just to state a position to begin with, I'm not sure there are any limits in principle on explanation. There are lots of things we don't know how to explain, but I'm not sure there are limits of principle at all anywhere. But it's very interesting that several of the panelists have mentioned phenomena that essentially have to do with experience of music. You mentioned visual experience, religious experience of understanding poetry. And it seems to me in this area, one of the most important things to get right is what kind of explanation would succeed in explaining the sorts of features of phenomenology you were both talking about, and that's relevant in the music. It's no good having, for example, just a neurophysiological explanation of the sequence of brain states that end up with a perception of, let's say, some late Beethoven string quartet. You've got to give, first of all, a very clear statement of what it is that's got to get explained. And that's a huge part of the challenge. I mean, in the case of visual experience, people now have a very good conception of the very rich content visual experience has. All of us now have an experience of a room around us, people. We experience the other objects in the room as conscious. We experience direction of the light and so forth. A very complex thing. In the case of music, it's even more interesting. The very first step is try to explain what the experience is, and people have not really done very well on that. Music has a syntax, it has a structure. You can give something that's an analog of a grammar for it, but it obviously does have an emotional content, has some kind of significance that's not exhausted by its syntax. If you take, for example, just the difference between hearing a major chord and a minor chord, you just play a C major triad on the piano and then play the C minor triad, it's right to say that the C minor triad sounds sad. The right description of that experience presumably is that you hear it, the minor triad, as a subdued version of the major. There's a comparative element there. You're hearing one thing as another, just as you can perceive one thing as another, think of one thing as another. So there's a very rich content that needs to be explained. What I don't see is that there's any obstacle to giving the right kind of explanation of that once you've got the correct conception of what it is that's to be explained. So to take visual experience,
but what is to be explained?
So what is to be explained is the occurrence of a conscious state with a very, very rich content. Right. It represents the world as being a certain way. It's got a certain emotional content in the musical case. Now, in the case of visual experience, that's what computational psychologists of vision do. And I think it's wrong to say that a computational psychology of vision doesn't explain why the experience has the character it does. So if you take a very simple explanation of the perception of depth, which is just disparity in the two retinal images, and there's a computation by the brain, not at any conscious level, of the depth that would make these images match in the right way. That's an explanation of why it is somebody can see something in depth. I don't think Husserl should be in the business of denying that. I mean, what Husserl wanted was an accurate description of the experience. Very good. That then gives you a task, an explanatory task. You've got to explain that rather than something else. But that just means you've got to get the right kind of explanation, not that no explanation is possible. So if I was understanding the earlier discussion correctly, I'm more in agreement with what you're saying. There isn't really incompatibility between giving explanations here and respecting the really rich nature of the phenomena. You have to respect respect the rich nature of phenomena. If you don't have that as part of the initial explanatory task, then there's no hope of getting the right explanation because you're not aiming at the right thing. But I don't think that means explanation is impossible.
But you would agree that, I like what you say very much. I don't think I disagree with it at all, but still you would admit, and that's relevant to Bob Michels' observation, that the computational model does move us to a different level, as it were,
Absolutely, yeah.
of clarity and understanding than were we to stay with the visual experience itself. Yes, it may enrich it. Yes, it may illuminate it. But it does seem to me we have to acknowledge that there's a shifting of gears here that is not trivial. It's very, very important. Perhaps that's all that Husserl meant. I think he meant we can't just move from one to the other as if the description of that experience shaded without change, without any important alteration into the explanatory model. Something has changed. Something's importantly different. If I get a computational analysis of the visual experience I had, and that difference, I think phenomenology is probably underlining or emphasizing more than you wish to in your statement. So I'd like to hear, so how do you feel about that? What about the difference? I'm just calling it level, so to speak. I don't know of any other word for it. Layer. You know, these strike me. They're not operating on the same layer of consciousness or experience. Clearly not.
Yeah, I like to talk about levels very much, but I don't think it undermines the claim of explanation. That's the crucial point. When somebody says, look, you perceive the thing as this distance rather than that distance because that's the distance at which these images will match in the right way to give you stereo vision, that's an explanation. It's an explanation that's not purely at the neurophysiological level at all. It's a computational explanation, right? And so it is an explanation at a different level. Supports different counterfactuals. And isn't given just by a complete neurophysiological description by the brain. You need to use the notion of the content, what's getting computed. So it is a different level. But the point I'm insisting on is it's still an explanation.
Could I just say something first, ask Bob about this? I mean, when you're, as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, when you're confronting, facing with a person.
You don't face a person when you're a psychoanalyst.
Or the person's on the couch. Okay, but in a way, yes, or listening to a person. I mean, surely that there are, one might come up there against sort of ethical limits of explanation. I mean, when we're dealing with other people, I mean, to what extent are we actually entitled to try to explain them? I mean, don't you think there is a problem there? And that diagnostic terms, for example, if you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, this would actually, as far as I know, it would categorize many forms of religious experience as basically stark raving bonkers. And I mean, so there are tensions in the area we're talking about, aren't there?
Well, that would be true, I think, if one thought that an explanation could replace the thing you're explaining or totally comprehend all perspectives and all aspects of it. I'm not sure I know what it means when someone says a true explanation or the explanation or the whole explanation. Most things that you explain remain the potential, all things maybe, have other potential explanations. Take the concrete, obvious example of depth perception that we used a minute ago. In fact, it isn't only explained by the difference on two retinal images, because somebody with one eye has depth perception. So we need another kind of way of looking at it, and there are multiple ways of explaining it, and it has other perspectives that can be brought to bear on it. And certainly in something as simple as the depth perception phenomenon, that's true. When you get to the kind of phenomena that a psychoanalyst is interested in, you're dealing with a huge number. I think there'd be a very interesting question whether it's huge or infinite, and I won't go there. but a huge number of potential explanations, none of which would fully encompass what it is you're dealing with, and that would certainly be true if you're talking not about a dream or a fantasy, but a person. When you get to things like DSM, you're using the crudest of categories to describe something so complicated as a person. And if you say someone has neurosis or the flu, you're certainly not saying everything interesting that can be said about that person.
Can I say two things about that? what's explained is always a particular property of an event or a particular relation. So the question is there a complete explanation of the events having that particular property or that particular relation? That's the first thing I want. The second thing I want about depth perception. The experience of stereopsis is quite different from the kind of depth perception you get with just one eye. Both do represent depth, I completely agree, but it's a different kind of experience, and indeed the people who've only ever had monocular vision are stunned by the idea there can be such a thing as the kind of perception of depth you get in stereopsis. It's phenomenologically different, Husserl would say. They're very different things. So it is true that there's a quite distinctive property. There's different ways of perceiving depth, but if what's to be explained is one particular way, then the retinal disparity is the explanation for that particular way. There's other explanations of other ways of perceiving depth. There are many ways of perceiving depth, I agree. But if we've always got to fix on this, there's never a total explanation of one particular event. An event has got a billion properties. It stands in all these different relations to other things in the universe. It's got itself got a lot of intrinsic characteristics. But the question is, you've got to fix on a particular property event. Can you explain why the person experienced this particular kind of emotion in relation to that particular object, then at this particular intensity, and then maybe there is such a thing as a complete explanation. We may be interested in different aspects of it, but I'm tempted to hang on to the idea that there's a full explanation. Maybe naive.
Francisca.
Yeah. Whenever we talk about explaining a particular event or having the right explanation of a particular event, it seems to me you're presupposing something that can be questioned, which is that there is such a thing as a particular event. And I think that's what you began with. And that's what I would like to question. And this goes back to Mark's question about how do you know when you have an effective explanation. It seems to me that you can't take context out of any definition of an event. So I'm not sure there is such a thing as a particular event. That given event is going to be different according to context and according to the need that's driving the explanation in the first place. So this is getting I don't know how to describe it.
Metaphysical is the word, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe a bit postmodern.
Exactly.
I'm questioning the idea of the event. Now, you said a given event, of course, has many characteristics and many properties, but I would go further and say I don't know what you mean by a given event. It's going to be differently defined according to concrete circumstances, and that is what will determine what an effective explanation is.
Yeah.
And I think Bob is a Buddhist because I very much agree.
You know that all the time.
I think a problem, at least I see within the debate and the study of religion, is this assumption that you have to choose between explanations. And I think that's where the fallacy lies, that you have to choose between the better explanation and the lesser explanation, but you can't determine what that is unless you have a concrete context, which will never be replicated again, even if you have the same actors and the same descriptive situation.
Well, the word effective was used. I have an even weaker word that I would use in assessing an explanation. Is it interesting? And my test would be, am I glad that I spent the time to listen to it? And did it enrich something for me? And I can't imagine why an explanation would take anything away from me unless it comes with requirements I can't think of quickly. And the notion, it's not in a philosophic dialogue, but in the, quote, the real world, it seems to me the test of an explanation isn't whether it's final or definitive or the complete or ultimate, but simply, does it add something?
Yeah.
Do I know more with it than I knew without it?
To me, it's a little like, it's just like a better explanation. It's just, it's better than the last one. It's sort
More
of like,
interesting.
sort of like when, when Einstein basically improved on Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics was fine, but special relativity
It's more elegant.
More.
Yeah.
Explain more. It's just that it allows you to be able to look at the world in a very, very different way.
It's interesting that ophthalmology makes El Greco more interesting.
I wonder whether it does, actually. But,
Exactly.
Well, I like that example because it seems to me that it can be misunderstood. There's a serious problem in what happened, but it wasn't that your German tourist said El Greco had astigmatism. It's that after saying it, he turned around and walked away.
So you didn't.
If he had stayed there saying, El Greco had astigmatism, let's see what that does, that would have been a nice experience for him, for you.
Well, what actually happened was he said to me, my wife thinks I look rather like that person in the El Greco portrait. What do you think? And I said, you need to grow your beard a bit. But anyway, it's not. I kind of agree with that in a way. But I was thinking about your very weak definition. In a way, I'm surprised that I'm quarrelling with it. But I was thinking in relation to Mark's area of paleontology. As far as I know, at one time, some very ingenious bishop came up with the idea that when fossils began to be discovered, that actually God had planted these fossils, to try to keep that old idea that the world was, creation happened from 4000 BC. But that's quite an interesting story.
Well,
but
certainly, like getting back to the idea of postmodernism and stuff. I mean, it's really interesting to look at the way in which that fossils were interpreted in different cultures around the world, and continue to be interpreted in different cultures around the world, because there's ideas that run the gamut of it and stuff. But I mean, I think within the context of empiricism is that they're interpreted the same way. And I mean, I think that there's a way of looking at the world which I have to often say isn't always the most satisfying or most illuminating way to look at the world, but of just reducing it down to just
It seems to me that there's an important difference now emerging between Bob Michels' position and Christopher Peacocke's, because, I mean, Bob is invoking, he's not only a Buddhist, he's an aesthete. Right? He's an aesthetic Buddhist, because he's invoking the criterion of interest or being interesting, which I find interesting. I like it. I think, however, it won't cover all the cases, because the very case of the bishop, you see, who proposed that God planted the fossils is interesting, especially in a religious culture that would like to believe it. So then how can we really hold on to that much longer if we take the more sober view introduced by Christopher, where the criterion, I would call it, is appropriate. That is, because Christopher's arguing that no, we're not trying to explain an entire event. We'll concede that with your point, we'll concede that this is far too complex to ever unravel. But a certain feature or attribute or point could be appropriately explained. And the more narrow the sub-phenomenon, the more appropriate the explanation can be. In fact, should be. Now, that doesn't strike me as being anything that would have either pragmatic or aesthetic, because I think Mark was invoking a pragmatic criterion earlier with the notion of effective. It seems to me this is distinctively different. This just means, I'm not sure Christopher is going to accept this, this is how I'm hearing him. He's saying that the explanation really fits down to the last iota the specific feature of in this case, depth perception, better than any other, whether it's interesting or not, whether it's effective or not, in a subsequent history, knowing that, right, whatever happens to it. Still, nevertheless, it's an advance in explanatory power to be able to say, well, depth perception is a kind of computation, that's going on spontaneously, not consciously. And it works. It really works for that very particular phenomenon, not for sight in general, not even for depth in general, admittedly. So then I really see a chasm of difference opening up between the two of you see, on these matters.
Well, I want to go to the bishop's explanation. I would say it's a first-class explanation except for one detail, which is I can't imagine any act it would lead to that would either confirm it or disconfirm it. Mm-hmm. So it is a category of explanation that falls outside the realm of science. It happens to have the nice characteristic of explaining absolutely all known phenomena related to paleontology and fossils. Every one of them, and not only all current known ones, but all future known ones. However, that leads
I think you have to also look at it within, like when the Bishop of Usher did that stuff, you have to look at it within the cultural context of the times. I mean, that because certainly like that, it was about the same time that Darwinism was coming around and everything else and stuff. And I mean, times were really in flux and stuff, and that this was mostly just to preserve the English Victorian status quo, and that it wasn't just that his explanation for these things outside of all, as a scientific explanation would be, or even scientific explanations like in the world we would like to exist would, but even often then they're majorly cultural contexts, within a cultural context, and certainly that explanation was, that it was to preserve the church and it was to preserve other things. So.
Yeah. I'd like to say something about the aesthetic and the role in explanation. I don't think you can just say something's a good explanation, it's interesting. There are lots of good explanations in a physics lecture, maybe a boring lecture. There may be correct explanations. They may not be interesting to someone. But the aesthetic is... when people say that the theory of special relativity is beautiful, they are onto something. But I think when one looks in detail, unfolds that, what's beautiful about it is that the laws of nature are the same in all frames of reference. And if that weren't the case, something would be unexplained. Why should they be different in this frame of reference from that one? So I think there is such a thing as an aesthetic sense here, but I think it's answerable to facts about explanation, that our aesthetic sense latches onto something that would be explained and would otherwise be unexplained. So I don't think it's a kind of autonomous criterion for the acceptability of an explanation. It's really explicable in terms of something else.
Certainly the aesthetic, when Watson and Crick came up with the central dogma and stuff, long before that there was any real evidence for the RNA replication and things like that. That was a great piece of work. It was wonderful. And then years later, to say, it's obvious because we have empirical evidence for it and stuff. But there is a huge bit of aesthetics in all of that.
In some sense, it's beautiful, but it's beautiful because it's simple.
Exactly.
And it would be a good explanation. Yeah. Right.
I was just wondering if there was anyone sitting here who has got something burning to.
In the discussion, that there's a uniform relationship between experience and explanation. But really, isn't it the category? Aren't there very different relationships depending on the category of experience? Tim, it's one thing to talk about an explanation relative to sight. Suppose you're talking about the experience of oneness with the universe. There has to be a very different relationship with explanation.
That's true. Okay, anyone would like to?
So you're talking about the scope or breadth of the phenomenon, which, once it surpasses the kind of criterion or limit that Christopher is talking about, which is a particular feature of a given experience or event, once it's beyond that, delimited model, and you're saying that, well, then somehow the explanation must have a commensurate expansiveness that would match.
Beyond explanation.
Well, how would you know that what's beyond explanation? Because it seems to me, I don't think you could know that in advance, in principle, what could not be explained.
The gentleman here.
I wonder about two other elements. First of all, the kind of explanation that can amounts to an illumination of a pattern. For example, Eyres, for example, is a description where you find in a society not something else that explains it, but just by going over the various forms of sport and politics and religion, find a pattern emerging, which then, in a sense, explains what you're saying, even though it doesn't go beyond the phenomenon. But that's one thing. The other thing that I was wondering about is, I think, in a lot of common sense ways, we tend to think of explanation as a non-temporal reduction, if you like, of something that happens at a moment or that seems to have changed, and that the explanation is to show something that doesn't change, that in effect underlies it, so that the limit of explanation there, in that case, would be the momentary sense or feeling that we have. And insofar as it's momentary, that would be the limit, because the explanation would always be something that's non-temporal. I think that's the way science usually works.
But isn't that, I mean, if you're talking about just explanations for one-time occurrences, I mean, there's many explanations for one-time occurrence, like what caused World War I.
But those explanations always, as explanations, always invoke some sort of thing that is a relative constant, like the way, the ways that the interests of a state, or something like that. They bring a lot of non-temporal things to bear to explain that event. The thing that is always not explained is what's different in that moment than another moment.
Yeah, certainly it is. But I mean, speaking from what my profession is and stuff, I mean, it would just only be if you could bring it into some testable framework of saying that, well, this is a generality. I mean, that's what we're all after and stuff. Does this happen in a repeatable kind of way that we can predict? And with temporal things, it's one of the things that's frustrating as a paleontologist is because that we can't really say that much because life only evolved one time, and then if Steve Gould used to say, like, if they ran the tape back again, it probably would have come out differently. I mean, it's a single historical kind of thing. It's very difficult to make generalities.
But the thing that makes it a science, in effect, is Darwin's hypothesis, which makes a kind of timeless rule that underlies what's changed, and that's why.
Right, but that's only the big thing of descent with modification. I mean, after that, if you want to talk about particular things, about the evolution of certain groups of animals and things like that, that's just a general covering theory for all of it. It doesn't speak to how birds evolved or how why that amphibians exist the way they do today and stuff. So
I think this is a serious question because there was a philosopher who actually took this very seriously and I think thought along the lines that you have now outlined so clearly. That's Bergson, who argued that temporal events, particularly those that have what he called duration, are such that they're so radically different from anything that ever happens, not just in space but in symbolic systems, that the twain will never meet. And try as we will, and successful as some explanations are, satisfying, interesting, etc., Bergson, at least in his early work, he sophisticated this later, but in his earliest work he insisted. And it's very interesting that this occurred in the same period that we started talking about. It was in the 1880s. Bergson was also reacting to psychophysics, to the presumption that the human mind could become a kind of psychomechanics, could all be predicted and explained on spatially schematized models. So Bergson, even before phenomenology, interestingly enough, on his own, really thought this through, and he came to this very radical position that still has some merit, and that is that there's something about the temporality of events. It's not just event, but the temporal dimension itself will forever refuse to be fully explained, and certainly not down to its actual happening, which always remains a unique occurrence. Now, this is a very strong metaphysical position, and I think it has to be taken seriously. I really do. Most of us don't let ourselves go there because it's a little threatening to think, that any given occurrence is beyond explanatory models of any kind, however clever, however ingenious, etc., etc. But
You're not saying it's beyond explanatory models. You're saying it's beyond complete explanation.
Sorry, hold on a second.
Freud did not write the explanation of dreams. He wrote the interpretation of dreams, which is a completely different, much more Bob Michels kind of way, and also what you were saying, of understanding what I think we're trying to talk about, like depth perception. If you have a patient with 20/20 vision who doesn't have depth perception, you need to find an interpretation because the experience doesn't jive with the numbers. And that is the kind of thing I think that people in the room see, which is people organically or physiologically are fine, they've been cleared, and something's wrong, and you need an interpretation, not an explanation.
Yeah, within the
There's a mic, perhaps.
Within the field of psychology, there's a limit on what we try to explain. And what we try to explain is something like what Chris is saying, and that is we try to explain things that are replicable. So there was a time in psychology when introspectionism and phenomenology, I guess is related, held sway, and that went under. And it went under because one person would say something different than another person. And so the labs didn't agree around the world about what the phenomenon was that was to be explained. But in modern psychology, the first thing you have to do is sort of get the description right. And what that means is that you have to have a phenomenon that will replicate. So it doesn't outlaw a phenomenon. That's what you're trying to explain. But it doesn't, psychology as a science never tries to explain the moment-by-moment contextual, or very rarely tries to explain the moment-by-moment contextualized event. They're kind of beyond explanation. They try only to explain a subset of events that are those things like depth perception that everybody's going to see, with some exceptions, and the exceptions would be with patients. So if
quite a big exception.
So if a patient didn't have depth perception, presumably your explanation is going to be good enough that you can say, oh, well, it's because, they've got some problem in a particular nuclei in the brain where depth perception happens, and you look for that as a way to test the model or the theory or the explanation that you've come up with, and you might thereby modify it. But phenomenology it's used. Everyone wants the description. But they only want the description is limited.
In terms of experience, the domestic experience, and description, isn't it true that you can only really get closer to it through abstract thought? You cannot see what you think you're seeing unless you can think it through, just like you need a biologist needs a microscope. And just like also the addition of what you can think abstractly today, as it was said, at 9:30 you're thinking one, at 8:30 you're thinking one thing, but no individual, there's a limit on what anyone can think, and there always will be. You only strive towards relative truth, shall we say. But experience itself, you'll never get the truth. You'll get closer to it, but you have to think it through, or you can't even approach it.
Your particular, just taking one point that you made, Professor Casey, and in your critique of Professor Peacocke, you talked about the substrata. That there are elements. Yes, you could refine this down to subcategory. You got so taking sort of an atomic view of this, there were things of very perhaps lesser significance that could be explicable. But is there a place, if we narrow this down to a very, very simple events, are there places, and I pose this question also to you, where there's a cross where the two lines meet? If you take it like let's take the creation of water, ice from water, say something, and just for the sake of argument, I don't even know if I believe this, but if you take an incredibly simple event, is experience and explanation, do they cross? Do they cross? Do they meet in some way?
Well, they must meet because we are of course human beings with both capacities, and so I agree with this gentleman's remark that of course reflective power will illuminate experience. The question is how to trust and how to get to that other level of reflection from the descriptive level of experience, and how to know that this is a reliable way of getting. Some categories seem clearly extraordinary or preposterous for illuminating our current experience. At least across a certain subculture, it would be very difficult to maintain God's intervention in each and every case of fossil discovery. So we can discard those. But then there is a much more subtle, I think your question is there not a very subtle moment when not just bare or pure experience, which I think has been deconstructed by all movements in philosophy, including phenomenology, which no longer really would hold to anything we can just simply take for granted in any experience. Is much more complex because it's permeated by reflective and memorial dimensions that ingress deeply into that very experiential matrix itself, and cultural and political categories, of course, too. So they're chock-a-block in that, in that moment you're talking about, where you really have a very subtle mixture of the experiential, call it what you will, categorical.
You have an ideology established, and at the same time encompasses the total thing you could say experientially about it. There's nothing, is there something there could be nothing more said. I'm just playing devil's advocate. I don't even know if it's believable.
Could we have someone here?
So I'm going to get to a question, and just with a short preface, because I want to ask about your opinion of types of models or types of explanations. But just to summarize a bit what this gentleman was saying about the being out of time. So what I'm seeing there is that there's a generalization that's applicable to more than a particular instance, which is what Janet is saying, not in the explanation category, but in even describing the phenomena that have to be looked at themselves have to be generalized to some extent, and also the kinds of explanations. What you were saying, what Casey was saying, is that that Chris was moving to a different level, and what I see there is that you have a phenomenon, and then the explanation is going to invoke and use objects or processes and relationships that are not in the initial phenomenon being looked at. So when you're saying it's a different level, now you're in a reductive explanation, you're stepping down to a more finer level of detail, and you're looking at the dynamics. You're saying there's parts, and those parts are relating to each other in some kind of dynamical explanatory system. Now, with Mark Norell's, let's say we go to the evolution of human beings, you have to look at primates and trees. So the parts that you're using to do the explanation are not always inside the system, but they can be outside the system as well. So you're moving levels, but basically there's going to be new parts. The explanation is going to have different parts than are in the initial phenomenon you're trying to explain, and relationships of those parts. That seems to be a generalization to me. Now, the question has to do with, I'd be interested in your opinion of verbal explanations versus mathematical explanations, because both language posits systems of parts related through the way we describe, and mathematics with mathematical objects and the functional relations between the mathematical objects also has this parts and relations that we can model various kinds of systems. So I would be very interested in any opinions or truths that you may have about the difference perhaps of mathematical versus verbal, and or whether they are similar in a larger scale of having parts in relations, in dynamical relations that can be used to explain systems on various scales.
Well, that's quite a question. And obviously there are huge differences it seems to me, between mathematical and verbal explanations.
I would say there's nothing. There's no difference at all.
Oh, right. Well.
Go ahead. If a Popperian view of the world, it just requires a falsifiable hypothesis and stuff to be, and you have to. Whether you falsify it using the analytical tools of mathematics or other types of data, it just doesn't really matter. They're the same. They're just descriptors of the same thing.
Well, I'm not going to tackle that directly. I was thinking that all this goes back to Plato in a way, and one of the other persons seemed to me to be that who in some way it seemed to me was impatient with sort of words in a way, and would like to have been able to sort of establish everything in mathematical terms. And so it's a very old sort of question that. But I'd say that one of the big differences is surely that mathematical rules are kind of in some way much purer clearer than words, and they go across languages, and every language is, the world has thousands and thousands of languages, and they're all different, and there's a reason why they're all different. So obviously they can't be the same.
But there's different kinds of mathematical rules. There's elegant proofs of things, but then there's also the kind of stuff that I do, because I'm a lousy mathematician. It's the sloppy kind of stuff which you just run analyses millions of times and then sample on that distribution, which is much more of a narrative kind of thing than actually doing a proof. So
much of what we're saying is about how explanation involves some kind of abstraction or reference to a universal that's relevant to the particular that we're interested in. One way of saying universal in particular is a point in time versus a timeless. There are probably other possible ways of saying it. Another way of saying it is a mathematical formula versus a specific event. But implicit in any formulation of a question is the use of some language to describe the experience in the question. The translation to a language already is a proto-explanation. The language of mathematics is widely viewed as somehow being closer to the experience than verbal languages, because in verbal languages we're much more conscious of their cultural construction. But in fact, there are many mathematics, there isn't just one, and there are many ways of describing quantitative relationships mathematically, and the selection of the mathematical description already is a step toward a kind of explanation.
So I'm quite surprised you say that mathematical explanations are closer to experience. That sounds counterintuitive to me.
There's less cultural intervention between the experience and its immediacy and the generalization, so that when we say that Newtonian systems explain the movement of the planets, we can easily conceal from ourselves that that's a cultural language that's applied to data in order to generate a generalization that we feel is explanatory.
I see. This gentleman's been wanting to come in.
I would like to endorse what Bob said and then ask him a question I've always wanted to ask him. So at first, I think that the idea that the limit of explanation is the concrete anything, whatever it is, and abstraction is what explanation amounts to, as Bob says, whether it's abstraction in terms of a law that underlies seeming change, or whether it's abstraction of parts. And as Cassirer said, I think that the gentleman over here who put it into a continuum, that mathematics is like that science progresses by progressive abstraction in the line of what Plato says, and eventually reaches mathematics as its extreme form of abstraction, and that's what explanation is. Now, the question that I wanted to ask Bob, so I think he's dead right there, but the question I wanted to ask him is that he was speaking about, as a criterion, speaking about things as being interesting. But then a few minutes later, we heard him speak about science as something separate. Well, that wouldn't be this, that's kind of like, there are certain criteria or discipline which qualify something as a scientific. It's a distinction I've seen him, it isn't even a matter, I've seen him in his kind of tolerant mode, where if something is interesting and enriches experience, that's really all you ask of it. And then I've seen him in a very different mode, which none of us ever want to be subjected to, where we're claiming a scientific evidence for something that he holds us, that he will hold us to beyond any kind of hold us to a criterion that goes well beyond any kind of interestingness. I'm very curious about what the realm is and definition is of the science that has this much narrower.
I think I'm being asked a theological question, which is, amongst the various explanatory systems that we use in our society, one of them is labeled science. It's been a very popular religion in the last few hundred years, and has had many converts to it. And like all religions, it has certain rules for what it considers an explanation. Its rules include that it generates possible tests that might invalidate or support various hypotheses, and if a statement and an explanation in it doesn't generate any such tests, we say it doesn't belong in this particular theology. That's made it very popular with people, probably because they have deficits in their capacity for pure faith and need something else to support it. And in our faithless era, it's been an extraordinarily successful religion. That would be my primitive answer to your question, Larry.
The passion that you show seems to indicate that you're an adherent to that.
Many of my best friends are members of that religion.
I think Francisca says something.
Well, I guess I was looking for an opportunity to jump in and talk about Monhe, and it seems like, most of the comments have provided that opening. So I'll just do it. Yeah, it would feel good if I left here plugging my book.
Don't give an explanation, just do it.
Right. Good point. The poetry of this Buddhist monk that Harry mentioned is considered to be love poetry, but there's been an interesting controversy about what it means, the attempt to interpret it. And the usual reading is that he's not talking about a human lover, but his beloved country, that is Korea, that was under Japanese colonial rule during the time of writing, which was in the 20s. There's also been the contention that he was really talking about, allegorically, the goal of Buddhist enlightenment. So his lover was spiritual enlightenment as opposed to this political goal of regaining the sovereignty of his country. And then some people contend that he actually had a nun on the side that he was quite enamored of. And the reason why, and if you look at the poetry itself, it's quite sensual. I mean, there's very many tenors to the poems, but a lot of it is quite erotic, and it seems on the basis of the words, the literature alone, that he's talking about someone very concrete, someone very physical. But see, I think he was playing a joke on everybody in the tradition of the Zen master, because the point is it can be any of these things, because when you're in the realm of using poetry, literature, language, words and explanations themselves have no inherent content. All right. So the point is you can read it as a lament for his lost country, or you can read it as longing for a very human lover. But the point is you don't have to choose, and you don't have to say, which is the universal, which transcends the temporal dimension of Monhe himself, given his political and personal context. So, going back to Plato, as Harry mentioned, it seems to me there's a basic cultural division here, where in the Western philosophical tradition, if I can generalize, there is a fear of the temporal and of the many and a desire for the one. Right?
Plato said.
I mean, it's quite threatening to think.
It's really Parmenides.
Yes, it's Parmenides, exactly. This distrust of everyday level of experience because it offers up nothing consistent, nothing that you can hold on to atemporally. And I, in fact, teach a class called Religion Aesthetics, and I start with Plato's theory of art, where he wants to banish the poets from his ideal republic because they stir up the emotions, cloud the intellect and reason reason is the instrument that gets you to that timeless truth.
But by the way, we should say that it's Socrates who says this in a possibly very ironic way in the Republic, so we shouldn't be perhaps too clear about saying that Plato wants to do it, although, that's not just point.
But the point is, you can take another cultural approach, and it has been taken, where you see the explanations in the constant changing temporal elements, so that the challenge of an explanation is not its consistent reliability, but that you're able to come up with a new explanation that's appropriate to that particular context, which means you're going to always have a different explanation, and that's the whole ideal of the Zen master. There's always a different explanation. So it seems somewhat neurotic to always be in pursuit of that consistent explanation. I mean,
my lesions also have that. Going back to the ancient Greece, my lesions have that variable changeability, Thales and Alexander.
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental question, whether you believe it's the timeless that's reality, or that incessant,
It's not correct to say that's the Western tradition.
It's a big generalization.
Equally strong in a tradition that's just the opposite.
Yes, I mean, comparisons are always quite tricky. It depends on the scale that you're operating at, but your point is well taken.
But the difficulty in the alternative that you present, let's call it, to be neutral, the polysemantic view that that every phenomenon has several equally persuasive explanations. Let's just stay with the word of the evening, right? And then you have another way of thinking that one, let's call it the monosemantic view, will and should prevail, either for religious or scientific, or for this particular strain in philosophy, let's call it the Parmenidean strain, that should prevail. Now, how are we going to adjudicate between these? I mean, you are posing an important alternative, it seems to me, and it seems just right to move to another culture. It's not as if, I agree that my lesions were very close to this, certainly Heraclitus, but still they didn't put it quite that way. And to talk about, sheer and deep flux is still not to move to your model, which I think is really that of alternative semantic dimensions, each of which is quite valid, attractive, interesting. The trouble is, then, what if you really would like to know which is most, I'm going to go back to a word that Christopher's remarks inspired in me, appropriate for that phenomenon. How are you going to choose?
Yeah, well, that's where you have to meditate a lot.
All right, okay. Okay.
Good point. Appropriate to what? Appropriate to the reader or to the cause? And that's where I think you get confused when you raise that question of appropriateness. You're talking about causality or the way it's interpreted by the reader. And the most frequent lost word tonight, I believe, is multiple determination, which you brought back into the discussion, that most of the events that we encounter in psychoanalysis have more than one determinant. And most of the things that you're talking about or trying to isolate have single determinants, or at least indefinite perceptions. There's a process. You brought back the question of multiple determination and ambiguity, and we lost track of it.
Well, I'd like to ask a question. I'm very interested in Manet's writing there. Your description of the explanation of the interpretation of his writing is quite similar to King Solomon's Shir Shir, Song of Songs, where it's also explained similarly, almost verbatim, as you said, that he's either writing about a country and he's writing about a lover, or something that's completely different than what we know, but there seems to be a pattern in there where someone so emotional as this character you described, which I'm not really that familiar with, really takes the object of his love and desire and will and explains it in a love poem, whether you're prepared to.
There's many traditions of allegorical religious literature, and Song of Songs is a good example of that. But I think we tend to, whenever we use the term allegory, always think in terms of the metaphor versus the truth, or what is actually being spoken of, by other means, so that one is not implicated in some way relative to what the person actually wants to talk about. And what's interesting about Manhe and the instruction that he gives in the preface to his volume of poetry is, what to me he's explicitly saying is, allegory doesn't work, because allegory assumes that hierarchy of explanation right? Where one is, again, only figurative, whereas the other is literal. And the point is to give up that hierarchy altogether and say that you only have figurative readings. So that would be the one difference I would point out.
We're talking about works of art in these two, but I would say one of our probable definitions of an important work of art is that there are multiple explanations, that they feel complete, but they're distinct, and that we can at some level experience more than one of them, and often, to introduce a foreign term, sense that one or the other is unconscious while we're conscious of the other. And if a work of art on deep reflection has only one meaning, we usually discard it.
Right. And ambiguity in art is very important in the sense that if it has one meaning, it becomes boring and rejected very quickly.
It's not interesting.
Right.
I still slightly feel that I agree with that in a way, but can I just quickly say that explanation, I sort of still wanted to perhaps bring back something that Ed was at the beginning, which was to actually put it in question in a way that we haven't been doing recently. I'm not sure works of art need explanations as much as somebody said there, and interpretations. And I've noticed that no one has gone back to the etymology of the word explanation, which actually has to do with flattening and to explain, or from Latin to make plain or flat. That does seem to be something that we should think about, and that that I'm not sure that. I wanted to sort of slightly put a spanner in the works there because I feel almost agreeing too much. But there's a gentleman here in the back.
When you talked about the multiple interpretations of a work of art, and the more of them there are, in some sense, the more interesting the art becomes. The question then arises, and that speaks to most of what's been talked about tonight, is, are there any limits to interpretations that are is there any sense of a validity as a criteria for interpretation? Are some interpretations unacceptable? Are some connections to a phenomenon unacceptable? I was really struck by that when you describe what do we mean by the limits of a phenomenon, and it seems very Buddhist to begin with, that this sense of a phenomenon expanding out. Are there any limits to them?
Sure, you can invoke criteria of validity, but the point is you can't do it beforehand. I think that's the problem, trying to determine beforehand what is going to be a valid explanation or not. You can never know.
Within the context of what? Art, you mean, or?
The context of...
certainly that as a scientist you have limits of things that you would call valid, like 5% level.
Hasn't attempts to determine what is valid in scientific explanation fallen?
Certainly you can say what's invalid.
Okay.
The scientist is much more comfortable saying there's a bad explanation rather than a correct explanation.
If you're talking, just to follow up on that, your question about in science, I think I'm correct when you apply Popper. There is a valid explanation. It's an explanation which can be disproved.
Yeah, at least rejected.
So there is, in one context, there is a definition of what an explanation is.
Yes, but it's fallen short. As Larry Loudon points out, creationist theory is falsifiable according to the Popper. It's falsifiable. It makes predictions. It may not be conclusive. If you talk about flood theology, you can predict that you will.
It's been falsified.
It's not to say. Don't get me wrong. I'm quoting a philosopher of science who is taking other philosophers of science to task for using falsification as the demarcation criteria of what's the difference between science and non-science.
Sure, I would say creationism is. a branch of science that's been falsified.
The criterion is wrong the other way around too. I'm trying to agree with you. If you look at all of string theory at the moment, it's a huge argument because that people don't know how to...
Even the proponents of string theory do not deny that ultimately it is based upon the fact that it has not yet been disproven. They admit that it is science because it can be disproven.
No, but they don't know how to at the moment. That's the point. If you ask what would be evidence, they hope that one day they would be able to say what would be evidence. But they can't actually say...
would be, they just don't have the physical means.
No, that's not true. That's not true. It doesn't distinguish between the various forms of string theory. The people dispute which is the correct form. But this is not a matter of getting more power into the accelerator in Geneva or in SLAC or somewhere. It's because that wouldn't be enough. What they have got is a conception that if the little strings were like this, it would explain the observed phenomena. But there are rival theories of it, and they don't know which would be the correct one.
Don't you agree every one of the components of the various different aspects of string theory still rely on the fact that their theory will rise or will prevail or not based upon the ultimate ability that it can be disproven, and coming up with a fact that disproves it?
They hope that they can find evidence for it. That's a hope. It's not true at the moment that it's meaningful only because they know what would be a falsification of it. They don't.
I think it's unfortunate to the limits of explanation. There are so many things that we'd like to get explained that we don't understand. That's not good. So to make that sort of a good thing, these limits, and not go further to try to explain things, I think is not a good thing. Especially in the political world.
A theme that's been rising in the last about 8 minutes, which is, I think it's very interesting that the term evidence has now come in. It seems to me that's very helpful. That's very important. So it's better than experience, with which I started, because I was presenting, just the classical view of phenomenology, but I actually prefer evidence because it goes beyond testability, it goes beyond falsifiability. It does involve an experiential factor because it does mean that someone has to be in the presence of the evidence to vouch for it, describe it, and indeed to quantify it. So there is something about evidence that's actually may help to bridge the gap that really we have started from between description and explanation. It may be the variable that somehow holds them together. I don't know. It's just suddenly occurring to me that there's something here. No limited sense of legal evidence. I'm not talking about material evidence. I'm talking about a rich and polyform notion of evidence itself that would be pertinent, important in the disambiguation of virtually any human circumstance, including theological circumstances, what counts as evidence. So there we have a dimension we haven't really confronted this evening, although it arose spontaneously, I think, in this last phase of the discussion, that would be crucial to explore. We've seen the danger of relying on personal experience, the limitations, the cultural limitations, for example, of that, the psychoanalytic limitations of that are well known. But it does seem to me there's something crucial about evidence here that needs to be considered if we're going to try to avoid nothing like just a chasm between description and explanation, which is tempting to endorse when we put different camps of philosophy and science, against each other. Okay, tempting. But here we need to rethink, what would count as evidence across the fields and differences. It seems to me this would be very, very crucial to figure out.
I think that's important. But I was thinking that that this is quite an important area because anecdotal evidence has generally been considered weak, hasn't it? But in fact, if we include things like poetry or something in anecdotal evidence, then it seems. I feel that that's a very important issue. That the notion of evidence should be expanded to include things like poetry. But we have to accept in the world we live in that poetry is not generally considered to be evidence of anything. No. So this is. That's true. But there was a lady there who wanted to get in a while ago.
Well,
there are two ladies.
A kind of evidence in art, which kind of relates to the evidence you're talking about in science, is something called the golden mean, which may be interpreted as as being able to engender a highest common denominator of response, which is a kind of evidence.
I'm not quite.
All right, I'll give you an example.
You're suggesting. I know the idea of the golden mean is a kind of proportion in a painting.
Proportion, what I'm saying is a recognition of what we might call greatness, something that's above the tree line of muzziness, of not knowing if something's good. A Leonardo portrait, the Golden Gate Bridge, a great engineering feat, a string theory, whatever. It's worth consideration because there's a highest common denominator that maybe is very hard to define, but the golden mean is actually a measurement that artists had used to explain what looks right, what feels right.
Right. But are we saying that gives it any? I mean, the fact that you think that gives it validity, that gives it more validity than?
Well, I'm proposing that our experience as a culture is we've pinpointed certain high spots in man's achievement as being something that we all can understand.
Anyone like to, Bob?
I want to try two definitions. Evidence is some statement about a generalization that's an interesting addendum to our experience of a particular. Evidence is viewing a particular in terms of whether it enhances our confidence in some generalization.
And is accessible to others, right? We'd have to add the right. That's the one.
That's a scientific issue about evidence.
Well, okay,
but I think a non-scientist might not require, or even a psychoanalyst might not require that.
Can I bring in this lady who wanted to talk before?
First I wanted to say that, like Bob, I've discovered I'm a Buddhist, and more important, that one can be a Buddhist and a psychoanalyst. But I thought that of particular relevance to analysis is the fact that perhaps explanation in analysis could be misused to flatten experience. And I wanted Bob's in particular, his comments about that. And actually there is a controversy or a tension right now in analysis between schools that, let's say, are advocates of pure experience, to exaggerate a bit, and schools that rigidly adhere to explanation, but sometimes one would hear a grotesque caricature of understanding used precisely to flatten the experience. This that I'm feeling from my patient is not really about me, it's about the mommy or the daddy, and therefore, and for the patient the same. That is grotesquely deformed in that way. That was one comment. The other comment is, I was thinking, I don't know how many of you have seen The Science of Sleep, but I thought that movie is a coda to this panel. You should see. Everybody should see.
Well, there was talk about coda there. Would anyone like to sort of add a word or two?
Well, I was just wondering if Christopher would elaborate a bit on what you said at the beginning, that anything could be explained now in virtue of what's been said about these different levels of going to an explanation for a poem versus an explanation of dinosaur extinction, let's say. I wonder if you could elaborate on whether you're still holding at this point, and if you could unpack that a bit for us.
Yeah, one of the things I said earlier on is extremely important to have a sufficiently rich conception of what the philosophers of science would call the explanandum, what it is that's to be explained. So your excellent example of this poem that's got at least these three general types of reading that can be sustained, and perhaps more. And I completely agree, in the case of truly great art, completely open-ended interpretability, that needs explanation as well. A relational structure has got this open-ended interpretability. That needs to be explained. We need to explain, first of all, to characterize exactly what the phenomenon is, and then how it is that human beings are capable of mentally representing such a thing. I don't see that the prospects are blocked for explaining causally how it is that we're able to do that, or what structures underlie it. But I think it really would be a flattening if we don't characterize the phenomena properly in the first place. That makes for a much greater challenge. What's got to be explained is much richer, and the explanatory resources that need to be brought in have to respect the richness of what's got to be explained. That doesn't mean explanation is impossible. It means you've got to rise to the level of phenomena that's to be explained.
Responding in part to Irene, I think the psychoanalytic situation faces a special problem, which is at least one of the participants is desirous of avoiding a certain explanation. That's not usually the way we think of the world of people seeking experience and enriching it. And all explanations abstract something. If you're desirous of avoiding something, the best way of avoiding it is by finding an explanation that excludes what the other explanations you want to avoid. So there's always the danger that an explanation will be used not to enrich, but to narrow the focus. If one is motivated to do that, it's always potential. We do it often enough not being motivated to do it. But in the analytic situation, really the technique, the methodology of the analyst is to be observant and ready to intervene to prevent explanations being used to shut off alternative explanations.
Those are spurious explanations, of course.
Not spurious. They're alternative. In fact,
we're not correct.
They're correct, but they exclude something.
But it's like the explanation of the poem. The psychoanalyst would say it was all about the nun, and the patient would say, no, it's about Korea.
Right. Both cutting off important explanations.
Right. Perhaps that's a good moment, a good place to leave it as provisionally without limits.